Imagine being a film studio executive in the mid-1970s.
Right. Sitting in a boardroom somewhere.
Yeah, you're sitting in a boardroom in Tokyo, and you are just sweating. I mean, you are bleeding millions of dollars.
Because the entire industry landscape is completely shifting underneath you.
Exactly. Because two young American directors named Steven Spielberg and George Lucas have essentially just invented the modern blockbuster.
Jaws and Star Wars.
Yeah, Jaws and Star Wars are just tearing through the global box office. They are completely rewriting the economic laws of cinema.
And if you're that studio executive, you desperately need a massive crowd-pleasing hit to save your bottom line.
Yeah.
You need your own Jaws.
Right, so you do what any desperate studio would do. You hire a glamorous, highly successful television commercial director, and you ask him to make a terrifying haunted house movie.
Which, sounds like a relatively standard industry pivot, at least until you see what he actually delivers to the studio.
Exactly, because he doesn't hire a seasoned screenwriter or adapt a famous ghost story. He goes home, sits down with his 10-year-old daughter, and asks her what she's afraid of.
And then he hands the studio a script featuring a carnivorous piano that bites off teenagers' fingers.
Yes, and a severed head that flies out of a well, and a house that quite literally eats unmarried women.
Oh, and the director himself.
Mm-hmm.
He developed this hyper-colorful, chaotic visual style as a coping mechanism after witnessing the atomic bomb drop on Hiroshima when he was 7 years old.
It's just wild. Welcome to another deep dive. Today, we are decoding the life, the art, and the staggering genius of Nobuhiko Obayashi.
It really is a story of alchemy, honestly. We're looking at a man who took the most profound, unimaginable trauma of the 20th century and somehow transformed it.
And not into bleak, punishing documentaries either.
Right, but into extreme, boundary-pushing, anarchic joy.
And even if you have never heard his name, I promise you, his DNA is in the media you consume. If you've ever felt unsettled by a horror movie that takes place in broad daylight, or watched an anime that completely shatters the boundaries between reality and a dream, you are feeling his influence.
Absolutely.
But to understand how you get from the ashes of World War II to a movie about a man-eating piano, we really have to start with the geography of his childhood. We have to go to a place called Onomichi.
Right, so Nobuhiko Obayashi was born in Onomichi on January 9th, 1938.
Yeah.
And understanding the physical and emotional landscape of this city is really the key to unlocking everything he ever made.
Because it's a very specific kind of place.
Yeah, Onomichi is a port city located on the Seto Inland Sea. If you picture it, it's this incredibly picturesque, almost poetic environment.
Lots of hills.
Yeah,
Yeah.
narrow stone staircases winding up hillsides, ancient temples overlooking the water, stray cats wandering through the alleys. It has this very specific golden, nostalgic light.
I mean, it sounds idyllic, like the absolute perfect childhood setting.
It was. For him, Onomichi represented the ultimate emotional home base. It was the physical manifestation of innocence and traditional Japanese beauty.
But there is a massive geographic reality looming over this idyllic setting.
Yes.
Onomichi is in Hiroshima Prefecture. It is perilously close to the city of Hiroshima.
Which brings us to August 6th, 1945. Obayashi is just 7 years old.
Right. Now, Onomichi itself wasn't directly hit by the atomic bomb, but the proximity meant he experienced the immediate shattering periphery of it.
He stood there and literally watched the distant sky turn white.
He saw the mushroom cloud rise over the mountains. In the days and weeks that followed, he lived among the survivors fleeing the devastation. He literally lost childhood playmates to the blast and the subsequent radiation.
Just imagine the psychological imprint that leaves on a child whose brain is just beginning to form its understanding of how the world works.
It's unfathomable.
Right, because at 7 years old, your primary belief is that adults are in control. They build the houses, they make the rules, they keep you safe.
But witnessing the atomic bomb completely evaporates that trust.
Exactly. He realized in a flash of light that the world could simply end without warning. And the adults in charge were the ones who built the systems that allowed it to happen.
They possessed no moral authority. They couldn't protect anyone.
Precisely.
Okay, let's unpack this, though, because I'm struggling with the connection a bit. If you are a child who witnesses the literal apocalypse, the horror of war, why not make a serious, sobering film about it later in life?
That's a very fair question.
Because you look at a movie like Grave of the Fireflies, which deals with the firebombing of Japan in a way that is incredibly bleak and realistic. That makes sense to me. Making a brightly colored, absurd movie about a flesh-eating piano almost feels, I don't know, disconnected from the trauma.
Yeah, I see what you mean.
Help me bridge that gap. How does a survivor of that magnitude of violence become a purveyor of surreal camp?
Well, that is the crucial paradox of Obayashi. He didn't process the trauma through realism because realism had completely failed him.
Oh, because reality is what produced the bomb.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Instead, he developed an understanding that beauty and total annihilation are not opposites. They coexist simultaneously.
Right. You can have the beautiful, nostalgic light of the hillside temples in the foreground and the mushroom cloud of absolute destruction in the background.
What's fascinating here is that to him, capturing that through strict, depressing realism wouldn't actually convey how absurd and disorienting the experience was.
So he leans into absurdism as a more accurate reflection of a broken world.
Precisely. It creates a peculiar double valence in his art. You have this surface brightness and aesthetic that is almost hyper-real and joyful.
But it's always acting as a thin shell, concealing a deep existential dread.
Yeah, the trauma never left him, but it surfaced obliquely. He believed that the only way to look at something that horrifying was through the distorting protective lens of fantasy and dream.
It's like a psychological defense mechanism translated into a cinematic style. And what is so fascinating is where he actually hones that style.
Right, because he doesn't take the traditional path.
No, he doesn't go straight to a prestigious film school, and he doesn't start making somber, independent features.
No, he teaches himself how to shoot on 8mm film as a teenager.
Yeah, absorbing bits and pieces of the French New Wave and American experimental cinema. And then he goes to work in advertising. In the 1960s, he becomes a television commercial director.
And we really need to unpack what the environment of 1960s Japanese television advertising actually required of a filmmaker.
It's intense, Rod.
Extremely.
Yeah.
This is not an environment that rewards quiet, contemplative art. This is the era of the Japanese economic miracle. Consumer culture is exploding. And the medium of television is ruthless.
I can only imagine you aren't building a 2-hour narrative arc. You are selling soap or cosmetics, and you have exactly 30 seconds to do it.
Exactly. You're working with extreme constraints, tight budgets, incredibly fast production schedules, and that strict time limit.
You can't rely on slow, psychological realism to build a mood.
Right. You have to use purely visual rhetoric to grab them by the lapels. The images have to be glossy, the editing has to be hyperkinetic, and the colors have to be saturated to the point of popping off the screen.
Because you're competing with 100 other stimuli in the viewer's living room.
Exactly. It has to be emotionally insistent.
It's like learning to paint by witnessing the apocalypse and then being forced to apply those colors to a 30-second billboard ad.
That's a perfect way to put it.
You have a man who fundamentally understands that reality is fragile and terrifying, but his day job requires him to apply that worldview to selling consumer goods with rapid-fire editing.
And he becomes a massive success at it. By the mid-70s, he is essentially the golden boy of Japanese commercial directing.
But he also maintains this parallel life, right?
Yeah. While he's directing these glossy commercials during the day, he's taking his underground experimental short films to the festival circuit on the weekends.
So he is living in two completely contradictory worlds: highly commercial, fast-paced advertising, and the deeply strange, rule-breaking world of the avant-garde.
Which perfectly sets the stage for that boardroom in Tokyo we talked about at the beginning.
Right. It's the mid-70s. The traditional Japanese studio system is under siege. Toho Studios, the legendary home of Godzilla and Akira Kurosawa, looks at the international grosses for Jaws and realizes the game has completely changed.
The audience wants high concept, visceral, genre spectacle. They want a monster.
So they bring in Obayashi, their star commercial director, knowing he can deliver something visually spectacular and commercially viable.
They wanted a haunted house movie. But what they didn't anticipate was his methodology.
No, not at all.
Because a typical director would have looked at the folklore of Japanese ghost stories, the yurei, and tried to modernize it. Obayashi bypasses all adult logic completely. He goes to his 10-year-old daughter, Chigumi.
I am so obsessed with this detail. He literally sits his child down and says, "Tell me what scares you."
And her answers are brilliant because they lack all the boring logical constraints of adulthood.
Right, an adult is afraid of a masked killer breaking in, or maybe a ghost with a tragic backstory. A 10-year-old is afraid of the everyday objects around her turning against her.
That is the genius of consulting a child. Children perceive the world with an intensity that adults have trained themselves out of. For a 10-year-old, the laws of physics and reality haven't entirely solidified.
The ordinary might, at any moment, reveal itself as monstrous.
Exactly. So when she suggests a piano that eats people or a mirror that attacks you, Obayashi doesn't laugh it off. He treats her ideas as authentic, primal expressions of deep psychological fear.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Wait, so Toho Studios asks for a Japanese Jaws, and he hands them a script based on a 10-year-old's nightmares featuring a carnivorous piano. How did this ever get made?
I mean, they must have just trusted his commercial instincts blindly, because the result is Hausu, released in 1977.
And to call it a horror movie almost feels inadequate. It completely violates every established convention of the genre.
Let's look at the basic narrative architecture, if you can even call it that.
Yeah.
The plot follows a group of 7 teenage girls who travel out to the remote country home of an aunt for summer vacation.
Right. And right away, Obayashi strips away traditional character development. The girls aren't given actual names. They are defined entirely by a single exaggerated personality trait expressed as a nickname.
Yeah, let's run through them.
Okay, you have Gorgeous, who is vain, Fantasy, who daydreams,
Kung Fu, who does Kung Fu.
Mac, who eats constantly, Melody, the musician,
Croft, the smart one.
and Sweet, who is gentle. They aren't three-dimensional humans. They are archetypes, like colors on a palette.
That is exactly the point. Because there is no clear protagonist, you don't have the typical slasher movie dynamic where you follow the final girl on a psychological journey.
Instead, you follow this collective of energy as they arrive at the aunt's house.
And the aunt herself is this emaciated, spectral figure in a wheelchair. She had been waiting at this house for decades, ever since her fiancé failed to return from the Second World War.
And the house itself, acting as an extension of her grief, is malevolent. It hungers for young, unmarried girls.
And the way the house devours them is where Obayashi unleashes everything he learned in his years of experimental filmmaking and TV commercials.
The visual effects are completely unhinged. I want to spend some time on this because it's important to understand how the movie looks. This isn't CGI, this is 1977.
The physical craft of the movie is staggering. He's using optical printing, rear projection, hand-drawn animation, laid directly over live-action footage, freeze frames, and extreme color tinting.
And he crams all of these techniques into single sequences. There's a scene where Melody, the musician, is playing the aunt's piano. Suddenly, the piano bites down on her hands.
But it doesn't just crush them.
No, it bites her fingers clean off, and the severed, bloody fingers just continue hopping up and down on the keys playing the song.
It's so visceral.
In another scene, a girl is attacked by a mattress that explodes into a flurry of feathers, turning the room into a blizzard until she simply vanishes.
And the most famous sequence, a girl's head is bitten off, and it flies out of a well to bite another girl on the rear end.
Yeah, and later, the bones of a devoured girl literally rearrange themselves into a spinning skeleton.
And here is the critical distinction we have to make. None of this looks real.
Right.
And it isn't supposed to. This is where we need to introduce the concept of affect.
Yeah.
Obayashi was not trying to create physical realism. If you want to scare an audience through realism, you hide the seams. You use shadows to hide the monster.
But Obayashi does the exact opposite.
Right, he proudly displays the artifice. The backgrounds are obviously painted mattes. The gore looks like bright red stage paint. The optical effects have visible halos around them.
I see what you're saying, but hang on. If I'm watching a movie and the special effects look obviously fake, it usually pulls me out of the movie. I stop being scared because I stop believing in the threat.
Yeah.
How does making it look more fake actually achieve his goal?
It's a technique drawn from theater, specifically what the playwright Bertolt Brecht called defamiliarization, or the alienation effect.
Okay, what does that mean in practice?
The idea is that if you present an audience with a perfect, seamless illusion of reality, they become passively absorbed. They stop thinking and just let the story wash over them. By constantly reminding you that you are watching a constructed piece of art, by showing the seams, you prevent the viewer from falling into a comfortable trance.
Okay, let me see if I have this right. It's like, if you go to a puppet show and they put up a little velvet curtain to hide the puppeteer, you can pretend the puppets are alive.
Right.
But if the puppeteer stands right in front of you, fully visible, holding the strings, you can no longer pretend it's a real little man talking. You are forced to confront the relationship between the creator and the object. You're forced to think about the manipulation itself.
That is a fantastic analogy, but Obayashi takes Brecht a step further.
How so?
Brecht wanted you to remain intellectually detached so you could analyze the politics of a play. Obayashi uses that same visible artificiality, not for intellectual detachment, but for emotional disruption.
So he's messing with your feelings, not just your thoughts.
Exactly. By stripping away realism, he circumvents your rational adult defenses and strikes directly at something primal. He wanted to convey the felt experience of terror and wonder, the way a child experiences a nightmare.
Oh, because a nightmare doesn't follow the laws of physics, but the terror you feel while dreaming is incredibly real.
Exactly.
And he completely weaponizes the editing to amplify that dislocation. You expect a horror movie to have a certain rhythm, a slow build of tension, a moment of silence, and then a jump scare.
But because he spent a decade making 30-second commercials, he edits Hausu with the rapid-cut hyperkinetic logic of an advertisement.
He might use 20 rapid-fire cuts during a scene of the girl simply eating a watermelon, and then hold a single, agonizingly long, static shot during a moment of horrific violence.
He refuses to give the viewer a reliable emotional grammar.
You literally don't know when you're supposed to laugh, when you should be scared, or when you should be sad.
It creates a perpetual state of instability. But beneath all of this candy-colored hallucinatory surface, beneath the flying heads and the kung fu fighting teenagers, there is an incredibly profound, dark depth.
Because Hausu is not just a campy joke.
No, it is a deeply serious film disguised as pop entertainment.
Right, and this is where the puzzle pieces of his childhood trauma really snap into place. How does a movie about a piano-eating teenagers connect to the atomic bomb and the Second World War?
It all anchors on the character of the aunt. Remember, she is suspended in grief, eternally waiting for a fiancé who died in the war.
Yeah.
Young girls who visit her represent the vitality, the youth, and the future that she was completely denied by the conflict. So she feeds on them to sustain her own unnatural existence. The aunt is a metaphor for Japan that has not adequately mourned or processed its wartime losses.
So, what does this all mean? It's as if the house itself is a physical manifestation of generational trauma. It's a Venus flytrap disguised as a warm, nostalgic family home, luring in the innocent youth to pay for the sins and the sorrows of the past.
Precisely. And the film adds another fascinating layer regarding gender.
Oh, right, the feminist critique.
Yeah, the scholar Linda Williams has pointed out that Hausu occupies a completely unique space in the history of feminist horror. If you think about the dominant horror tropes of the 1970s, movies like Halloween or the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, the threat is almost always external and male.
Right, the classic slasher dynamic. The violence is usually an expression of male desire or punishment.
But in Hausu, there are basically no men. The threat comes entirely from within the female world.
Oh, wow.
The aunt's desire for her own lost youth, her longing for the life she didn't get to live, has been distorted by loss into sheer monstrosity. The house is an extension of female longing.
So it refuses the simple, typical narrative of female victimization, but it also refuses the simple narrative of empowerment.
Exactly. Instead, it portrays the female experience as fundamentally complex and weird, existing in a space where desire, fear, and societal expectations of marriage create these genuinely monstrous consuming pressures.
It is a psychological minefield.
Yeah.
And we have to talk about how this all sounds, because the sound design of Hausu is just as vital and just as disorienting as the imagery.
Oh, the music is incredible. He collaborated with Miki Yoshino and Hiromi Hosono,
Who would go on to form the legendary electronic band Yellow Magic Orchestra.
Right, and they did not write a typical spooky orchestral horror score.
No, the music actively counterpoints the visuals. In most films, the score tells you how to feel. If it's a sad scene, the strings swell. If it's scary, you get discordant brass.
But in Hausu, you might have a scene of absolute carnage, and the soundtrack is a bouncy, upbeat pop rock song or the gentle, tinkling melody of a music box.
It sounds simultaneously childlike and sinister, like a festive threat. And that audiovisual dissonance perfectly taps into a concept that was central to Sigmund Freud's theories on horror.
Yes, the uncanny.
Right. The uncanny, or unheimlich in German, literally translates to unhomely.
It is the idea that the things that terrify us the most are not alien monsters from outer space. The most terrifying things are the familiar, domestic, safe things that have been slightly altered to become threatening.
Think about the layout of your own childhood home. You know every creak in the floorboards. You know the exact texture of the wallpaper in the dark.
Right.
Now imagine that the staircase you walked up every night suddenly developed a malevolent will. Imagine the grandfather clock in the hallway started ticking backward, or your childhood bed suddenly refused to let you leave.
That is the uncanny, turning your ultimate safe space into a trap.
And that concept of the uncanny, the familiar made strange, is central to Obayashi's entire filmography. Because if you only know Hausu, you might understandably assume that Nobuhiko Obayashi is just a one-hit weirdo who made a crazy midnight movie and vanished.
That couldn't be further from the truth. Haisu was just the opening salvo.
Right. If he had just stopped there, he'd be a trivia question. But what he does next proves he is an actual versatile master of cinema.
Yeah, after the bombastic sensory assaults of Hausu, he pivots in the 1980s into a completely different register. He begins making what is now known as the Onomichi Trilogy.
He returns to his childhood hometown, Onomichi, and directs 3 gentle, deeply emotional coming-of-age films.
Transfers in 1982, The Girl Who Leapt Through Time in 1983, and Lonely Heart in 1984.
And The Girl Who Leapt Through Time is the absolute standout here. It is a tender, incredibly poignant science fiction romance.
And what is so beautiful is how he handles the sci-fi elements.
Yeah, the time travel mechanics aren't bogged down in paradoxes or flux capacitors. He treats time travel the exact same way he treated the horror in Hausu.
Not as a literal mechanical plot device, but as a pure emotional metaphor.
In this case, slipping backward and forward in time is a metaphor for the adolescent experience of memory, regret, and the desperate longing to hold on to a fleeting moment of youth.
It demonstrates a level of emotional intelligence and restraint that must have shocked the critics who dismissed him after Hausu.
Oh, totally.
His observation of the teenage heroine's emotional life is precise and deeply compassionate. It proved he wasn't just throwing paint at a canvas. He could calibrate his style to evoke genuine, quiet warmth. This film remains one of the most beloved works in Japan's cultural memory.
It is so wild to me that a director who is so associated with severed heads flying out of wells can pivot to such delicate empathy.
Well, it makes sense when you look back at his very early work.
Yeah.
Because he wasn't some naive eccentric who just stumbled into visual innovation by accident. He had a profound formal education in cinema history.
Let's talk about his 1966 experimental short film, Emotion.
Right. Emotion is a 30-minute avant-garde film he made at the very height of his commercial advertising career. And it's basically a love letter to and a deconstruction of the French New Wave.
Now, when we say the French New Wave, for those who might not spend their weekends reading film theory, we're talking about directors in the late 50s and 60s, like Jean-Luc Godard and François Truffaut.
Right. These were critics-turned-filmmakers who basically said, the old polished studio way of making movies is dead.
They took lightweight, handheld cameras into the streets of Paris, used natural light, and broke the rules of editing with jump cuts to make films feel spontaneous, unpredictable, and fiercely alive.
Exactly. And Obayashi absorbed all of that. In Emotion, he incorporates footage of foreign films, still photography, actors directly addressing the camera, and rapid associative editing.
It is a fragmented meditation on cinema, desire, and identity.
It proves conclusively that he had studied the masters, Godard, Antonioni, Jacques Tati. He knew the strict rules of international art cinema perfectly.
And that is exactly why he knew how to break them so effectively. You have to know where the boundaries are before you can smash through them.
Yeah, absolutely.
We see this synthesis of deep genre knowledge and emotional resonance even in his later 90s work, like the 1991 film Chizuko's Younger Sister.
Oh, that's a great example.
It's a supernatural ghost story about a girl haunted by the spirit of her dead sister, but it manages to be supernatural while remaining intensely psychologically realistic.
He uses the ghostly elements as vehicles to explore the complicated, messy dynamics of female grief and survivor's guilt.
So if we accept that he is this deeply educated, highly strategic filmmaker who is masterfully manipulating genre, we have to look at how he fits into the broader landscape of cinema.
Where did Obayashi come from cinematically, and who were his true peers?
Because he didn't just drop out of the sky. Let's start with his domestic lineage in Japan. There is a very distinguished tradition of surrealist and fantastical cinema in Japanese history.
Oh, for sure. You have the pre-war ghost stories of Kenji Mizoguchi. You have the post-war innovations of Akira Kurosawa, specifically his later, highly stylized film Dreams.
And you have the existential dread of Hiroshi Toshigahara, who directed Woman in the Dunes.
Right, those are the towering figures. But there is a very sharp distinction to be made here. Japanese surrealism, historically, is very formally disciplined and tonally serious.
Yeah, Woman in the Dunes is an incredibly bleak, punishing exploration of human existence. It is not exactly a laugh riot.
Obayashi disrupts this prestigious tradition
Mm.
because he actually embraces formal anarchy and tonal instability as positive values. He doesn't want the austere discipline of Teshigahara, he wants the chaotic energy of a child's toy box.
Okay, so if he doesn't fit with the serious surrealists, what about the rebels? What about the Japanese new wave of the 1960s?
Directors like Nagisa Oshima or Shohei Imamura.
Yeah, they were breaking rules too. And you have Seijun Suzuki, who was making these wild, hyper-stylized Yakuza gangster films in the late 60s, where he would literally sacrifice the entire plot just to achieve a crazy pop art visual effect.
Suzuki is definitely a closer comparison in terms of visual audacity. But even within the rebels, Obayashi is an outlier. Because the new wave directors like Oshima were explicitly, loudly politically radical.
They positioned themselves fiercely against the mainstream society and against the studio system. They were making angry, confrontational art.
Whereas Obayashi's radicalism was entirely personal and psychological, and most importantly, he never fought the studios. He worked within commercial cinema.
I love this detail so much. He is basically a Trojan horse inside the Japanese film industry.
That's a perfect way to describe it.
The new wave directors are outside the gates throwing rocks at the studio. Obayashi just walks right through the front door. He wheels in this shiny, commercially viable exterior. Hey, Toho Studios, here is your haunted house blockbuster. Here is your teen romance.
And the executives gladly fund it.
But inside that shiny exterior, he is smuggling in this deeply traumatized, bizarre, Buñuel-esque surrealism directly to the mainstream audience.
It's a brilliant subversion. And since you mentioned Luis Buñuel, we should look at his international peers. The comparison to the surrealist cinema of Buñuel and Salvador Dali, particularly films like Un Chien Andalou, is very apt.
They share a willingness to deploy completely irrational, shocking imagery for pure emotional effect without ever feeling the need to explain it narratively.
But again, there is a difference in tone. Buñuel's surrealism is aggressive. It's designed to offend the bourgeois sensibilities of the audience. Obayashi's is more childlike, more invested in the texture of domestic experience.
He's also pulling from the American experimental tradition. He was heavily influenced by Maya Deren.
Oh, definitely.
For those who don't know, Maya Deren was a pioneer of the American avant-garde in the 1940s. She made these incredible trance films like Meshes of the Afternoon, where she used the camera to represent subjective, dreamlike states, completely unmoored from linear time and space.
You can see her DNA all over the floating, disorienting logic of Hausu.
But when we narrow our focus specifically to the mechanics of horror, the most striking parallel is to the Italian giallo tradition.
Yes. When we say Italian giallo, imagine a mystery thriller or a slasher film. But instead of focusing on the logical clues like a Sherlock Holmes story, the director completely loses their mind on the aesthetics.
The undisputed king of this is Dario Argento. Films like Suspiria in 1977, which is the exact same year as Hausu, incredibly.
The parallels between Argento and Obayashi are massive. Both of them understand horror as a purely experiential genre, not a narrative one.
In Suspiria, Argento drenches the sets in neon red and blue lighting, and he blasts this aggressive, pulsing, progressive rock music by the band Coblin.
It doesn't matter if the plot makes logical sense. It matters what it physically feels like to be terrified. Both Argento and Obayashi deploy hypersaturated color and extreme formal stylization to bypass the brain and attack the nervous system.
But here is the tragedy of it all. Despite this incredible lineage, despite synthesizing the French New Waves, Maya Deren, and commercial pop art into this totally unique vision, Hausu was largely dismissed by the Japanese critical establishment upon its release.
It was a moderate commercial hit with young audiences in 1977, but the critics just saw it as technically rough, frivolous camp.
It was essentially ignored by the international film community for 3 decades.
Which is truly mind-blowing when you consider its titanic status in global film culture today. And that brings us to one of the most fascinating phenomena in modern film history.
The Criterion Resurrection.
Exactly. I mean, how does a movie ignored for 30 years suddenly conquer the global film canon?
It is the ultimate Cinderella story for a piece of media, and it all pivots on the year 2009. An American distribution company called Janus Films acquired the rights to Hausu and released it in the United States through the legendary Criterion Collection. It became Spine number 539.
We really need to unpack the power of what is essentially a canonization machine. A boutique DVD distributor literally rewrote global film history.
Because when the Criterion Collection releases a film, they don't just put a movie on a disc and put it on a shelf. They release it with a massive apparatus of critical legitimation.
Right. They commission essays from respected film scholars. They record deep dive audio commentaries. They restore the print so it looks like a masterpiece. They arrange for prestigious museum screenings.
It's essentially like an underground, ignored street artist suddenly being given a massive curated solo exhibition at the Louvre.
Exactly. The art itself didn't change at all.
Huh.
But the frame around it changed. And because it was hanging in the Louvre, or in this case bearing the Criterion logo, the entire academic and critical world was suddenly given permission to take it seriously.
A film that was dismissed as campy exploitation was instantly reevaluated as a canonical avant-garde masterpiece.
And once that door was opened, once Hausu was widely available and critically validated, the influence began to pour out. And it is staggering to look at who was taking notes.
The list of modern directors heavily influenced by Obayashi is essentially a who's who of modern cinema. Let's start with Guillermo del Toro.
The man who made Pan's Labyrinth and The Shape of Water.
Yeah, he has spoken extensively about how discovering Hausu was a revelation for him. It showed him that horror could be purely cinematic, that image, color, and rhythm are horror's most effective tools, not just jump scares.
You can clearly see that DNA in the elaborate, almost fairy tale visual artificiality of a film like Crimson Peak.
We also see his profound influence in the work of the Scottish director Lynne Ramsay. If you look at her brilliant, disturbing film, We Need to Talk About Kevin, she shares Obayashi's deep interest in subjective visual states and traumatic memory.
Ramsay uses a fractured, nonlinear chronology and dissonant visual rhythms. She owes a direct debt to Obayashi's demonstration that you can manipulate cinematic time and space to represent a traumatized consciousness from the inside out.
And then there is the contemporary American horror renaissance. Directors like T. West and, most notably, Ari Aster.
The parallels with Aster are incredible. Think about Hereditary and Midsommar.
Aster shares Obayashi's obsession with the horror of the domestic space, the family home as a trap, and the terrifying dynamic of older generations literally consuming the youth to sustain their own twisted traditions.
Midsommar is the absolute perfect example of his legacy. Think about the visual palette of Midsommar. It is a horror film that completely refuses the conventional, nocturnal, shadowy aesthetics of the genre.
It takes place in a sun-drenched, flower-filled, brightly colored meadow in broad daylight.
That extreme color saturation, that insistence on daytime, celebratory horror, is a direct, undeniable descendant of Hausu.
And his influence doesn't stop with live-action horror. It bleeds heavily into animation. Satoshi Kon, the absolute genius behind anime masterpieces like Perfect Blue and Paprika, drew heavily on Obayashi's work to model the terrifying interpenetration of reality and illusion.
When you watch a Satoshi Kon film and you literally cannot tell if the character is awake, dreaming, or hallucinating, you're watching The Children of Hausu.
Also, Mamoru Hosoda, another titan of modern anime, literally remade Obayashi's The Girl Who Leapt Through Time as an animated feature in 2006.
But perhaps the most pervasive impact he had wasn't on specific directors, but on broader visual culture. Obayashi anticipated and helped birth an entire aesthetic movement that we now call kawaii horror, or cute scary.
Yes. The collision of the candy-colored, adorable palette with profound, supernatural dread. You see this everywhere now.
It's in the aesthetics of Harajuku fashion, the weirdly blank, unsettling nature of Hello Kitty, and the deeply terrifying body horror manga of Junji Ito.
Obayashi fundamentally proved that sweetness and terror are not opposites, they are complements. If you wrap a horrific concept in a bright, cute pop art surface, the cute surface actually makes the horror infinitely more disturbing because it violates our expectation of safety.
It is a profound cultural ripple effect. He also massively influenced the golden age of music video directors, visionaries like Michael Gondry and Spike Jonze, who adopted his extreme visual stylization, his visible in-camera effects, and his emotional directness to create these 3-minute surrealist pop masterpieces in the 90s and 2000s.
Which means, if you're listening to this right now and you've ever felt a little uneasy looking at a mascot character that is just a little too cute, or if you've marveled at the reality-bending dream logic of a Satoshi Kon anime, or felt the suffocating, sun-drenched daytime dread of Midsommar, you are feeling the direct, radiating ripple effects of Nobuhiko Obayashi.
His creative DNA is inextricably woven into the media you love.
And knowing that enduring, massive legacy makes the final chapter of his life incredibly poignant.
In many ways, his final years bring the core animating theme of his life, art born from the fires of trauma, full circle in the most literal way possible.
Obayashi was diagnosed with terminal lung cancer, and the doctors were incredibly blunt with him. They gave him 3 months to live.
3 months.
If you were given 3 months to live at the age of 75 after a long, successful career, what do? Most people would rest. They would spend time with their family. They would make peace with the end and quietly fade away.
But Obayashi was not most people. He completely defied the medical odds. He lived for 7 more years.
And during those 7 years, living under a literal ticking death sentence, physically deteriorating, he directed 4 massive, complex feature films.
He ran an absolute cinematic marathon. It's unbelievable.
And these weren't simple, quiet movies. One of those films was Casting Blossoms to the Sky, also known as Hanagami, released in 2017. And I want to be clear, this is not a quiet, reflective little indie drama made by a dying man in a single room.
No, it is a sprawling 3-hour, color-saturated hallucinatory egg set in the year 1941, right before Japan entered World War II.
It is an overwhelming work of art. The narrative follows a group of young, beautiful people living in a coastal town, much like Onomichi, as the massive, inexorable machinery of war slowly draws them toward their own destruction.
And instead of pulling back, he pushes his manic, kaleidoscopic visual style to its absolute breaking limits. The editing rhythms feel genuinely hallucinatory.
He uses extreme green screen effects, direct addresses to the camera, and bizarre, anachronistic intrusions.
But the emotional register is profoundly different now. Think about the contrast in Hausu. When he was younger, he was channeling the terror of his childhood into genre entertainment. It was a bouncy, chaotic horror movie.
But in Hanagatame, facing his own imminent death, he is channeling that exact same childhood terror into an act of profound, shattering mourning.
It is a sustained 3-hour elegy for all the youth destroyed by the war machine, drawing directly on those memories he had as a 7-year-old watching his playmates die in the aftermath of the atomic bomb.
He is bringing his entire life's work and his deepest trauma into singular, undeniable focus. And then, defying death one last time, he completes his final film, Labyrinth of Cinema, in 2019, knowing absolutely that it would be his last statement to the world.
It is described by critics as a pure love letter to the medium of cinema itself.
The plot is incredibly meta. It features 3 young men sitting in a crumbling, closing movie theater who literally fall through the silver screen. They travel backward through the history of Japanese cinema, and ultimately they are dropped into the brutal history of the Japanese wartime experience.
It's a testament to his lifelong, unshakable belief that cinema could literally be an instrument of peace. He's using his final breaths to tear a hole in reality and leave us this urgent message.
He ultimately passed away on April 10th, 2020, at the age of 82. But the beauty of it is that he lived long enough to see his redemption.
He lived to see Hausu elevated from a dismissed commercial curiosity to a canonical global masterpiece. He lived to see his life's work recognized, validated, and celebrated by the entire world.
So as we pull all of these threads together and synthesize this incredible life, why does Nobuhiko Obayashi matter so deeply?
Well, there are several dimensions to his legacy. Technically, he radically expanded the very visual vocabulary of cinema. He proved that the medium's tools of manipulation, the cuts, the colors, the frame rates, the optical effects, were expressive, emotional substances in their own right.
They weren't just invisible tools used to tell a story, they were the story.
Culturally, he matters because he captured the complex, ugly, beautiful truth of post-war Japan in a way no one else did. He refused the simple victim narrative, and he refused the triumphant rebuilding narrative.
He offered something much more complicated, much weirder, and ultimately much more true to the actual disorienting experience of a traumatized nation trying to find its footing.
And perhaps most importantly, he matters as a predecessor, a patron saint for the weirdos. He gave future generations of filmmakers the permission to trust their most extreme, undomesticated impulses.
He showed them that you don't have to be timid. You don't have to follow the rules of realism. You can completely refuse the consolations of convention.
He showed up to the world with the energy of a traumatized child who decides, against all evidence, to make something beautiful, strange, and loud out of the terror.
Which brings us right back to where we started. We usually expect a neat equation of cause and effect in human behavior. A devastating event creates a somber, devastating response.
But Obayashi completely broke the physics of trauma. He took the blinding light of the mushroom cloud and he alchemized it into the candy-colored carnivorous piano.
He used total uncompromising audacity to bear witness to history, and that leaves us with a final thought that I want to send you all away with today. Obayashi fundamentally believed that cinema could be a literal instrument of peace by forcing adult audiences to strip away their rationalizations and experience the world through the unfiltered, vulnerable, unstable eyes of a child.
It's a really powerful idea.
It makes you wonder, in our current era of hyper-curated, algorithmic media, where everything on our feeds is smoothed out, focus grouped, and designed to be easily, comfortably consumed, are we losing the ability to be genuinely shocked? And therefore, are we losing the ability to be genuinely moved?
It's definitely something to think about.
If you had to bypass all the neat, polite logic of adulthood and compress your deepest fears and your greatest joys into a purely visual, chaotic language, what would your own Hausu look like?
Thank you so much for joining us on this massive journey. Exploring the brilliant, chaotic mind of Nobuhiko Obayashi has been an absolute privilege. Until next time, keep questioning the frame.